This is an original, fictional story inspired by the drama of mining reality shows. All names, claims, and figures are invented for entertainment purposes and do not represent any real person, show, or event. Nobody thought this old machine had one more season left in it. Half the crew laughed when Jake Weathers pulled the tarp off that Washplant and said he was betting the entire operation on it. But 3 weeks later, when the first cleanup came in, nobody was laughing anymore, because the numbers didn't just beat expectations, they broke them completely. And what happened next would change how everyone on that mountain thought about gold mining forever. This story starts on a claim most people had already written off. The ground had been worked before, picked over by smaller outfits who took what was easy to reach and moved on. When Jake Weathers took over the lease, most of the local mining community assumed he'd run a modest, low-risk season and call it good. Instead, he did something nobody expected. He dragged out an old wash plant that had been sitting idle for 2 years, the same machine his father had used a decade earlier, and announced that this season wasn't going to be modest at all. He was aiming for a number that made even seasoned miners raise their eyebrows, somewhere in the range of 300 to 400,000 ounces of processed material value, translating into a haul that could reshape the entire operation's future. At first, this sounded like wishful thinking. The wash plant itself was a relic. Rust along the frame, a recovery system that hadn't been touched since the last major overhaul, and a reputation among the crew as something better suited for scrap than for a serious production season. Several of the more experienced hands quietly doubted the plan. One longtime operator, who'd been running equipment on that mountain for almost 20 years, said openly that betting the season on that machine was a mistake nobody would forget by autumn. But Jake had a different read on the situation. Built not on sentiment, but on data his team had quietly gathered the previous winter. Before committing to the plan, Jake's team had spent months running core samples across 5 separate zones on the claim. The numbers coming back from those samples suggested something the previous operators had missed entirely. A compact, high-concentration layer, sitting deeper than most surface operations ever bothered to dig. Combined with current market pricing for gold, the math pointed toward a season that could be worth well over $300 million if the recovery rates held up. That was the number that convinced Jake to take the gamble. Not gut instinct, not nostalgia for his father's old machine, but a spreadsheet full of drilling data that nobody else on the mountain had bothered to run. Committing to that number meant committing serious money. Rebuilding the wash plant wasn't cheap. The recovery system needed a complete overhaul, the sluice boxes needed refitting, and the whole frame needed reinforcement to handle a processing load nearly double what the machine had ever handled before. All in, the upgrade costs ran into the millions before a single shovel of dirt went through the system. Investors who'd been watching the claim from a distance started paying closer attention, some intrigued by the scale of the bet, others convinced it was going to be a very expensive lesson in why old equipment stays retired. When the plant finally roared back to life, it didn't look like the same machine that had been sitting under a tarp all winter. On the outside, sure, it still had the dents and the faded paint, but underneath, Jake's crew had rebuilt nearly every working component. Where the old plant used to handle somewhere around 100 to 150 cubic yards of material per hour, the rebuilt version was pushing through 200 to nearly 300. That alone meant more material processed in a single day than the old version could manage in nearly 2. And more material processed, when the gold is actually down there, means more gold coming out the other end. Processing speed was only half the story, though. The other half was efficiency. And this is where the upgrade really separated itself from a typical rebuild. The team had reworked the recovery system almost from scratch, improving how fine gold was captured before it could wash out with the tailings. Compared to a standard setup, the new recovery efficiency ran somewhere between 30 and 40% higher. On paper, that might not sound dramatic. In practice, when you're processing tens of thousands of cubic yards a week, an extra 30 to 40% recovery on fine gold adds up to thousands of additional ounces over the course of a season, ounces that would have simply washed away under the old system. The other piece of Jake's strategy that raised eyebrows across the mountain was his decision to run 5 separate sites simultaneously instead of focusing all his resources on one location. Each site had a distinct role. 2 were dedicated to fast surface extraction, pulling easily accessible material to keep cash flow steady early in the season. 2 more targeted the deeper, higher concentration layer the winter drilling had identified. The 5th was essentially experimental, a test bed for new processing techniques that, if successful, could be rolled out across the other 4. Running 5 sites at once meant Jake needed more than 200 workers, cycling through shifts around the clock, and it meant an enormous logistical challenge, just keeping fuel, parts, and manpower where they needed to be at any given moment. To manage that complexity, Jake's operation leaned heavily on something most small mining outfits never bother with: real-time data tracking. Sensors installed across all 5 sites fed information back to a central hub, tracking material processed, recovery rates, and equipment performance hour by hour instead of waiting for end-of-day reports. If recovery dropped at any single site, the team would know within minutes rather than discovering the problem days later during a routine cleanup. That kind of visibility let Jake and his lead operators make adjustments on the fly, shifting machinery and crew members to wherever they were needed most, squeezing every possible ounce out of the ground without wasting time chasing problems blind. None of this mattered, though, until the first cleanup actually happened. And that first cleanup is where the doubt in camp started to crack. When the gold came off the sluice and got weighed, the number landed somewhere between 300 and 400 ounces. A strong result for a single cleanup by any standard, but especially strong for a machine half the crew had assumed was going to be a disappointment. It wasn't the number that stunned people most, though. It was how calm Jake looked when he saw it. He'd been expecting it. The spreadsheet had been right. Over the following weeks, the daily recovery numbers kept climbing. What started as a strong first cleanup became a pattern of consistently high output. Days that produced 600, 700, eventually pushing toward the 800 to 900 ounce range as the crew settled into a rhythm and the Washplant proved it could handle sustained heavy use without breaking down. On the best single day of the season, the number reportedly cracked 1,000 ounces, a figure that even Jake's most experienced operators admitted they hadn't seen matched anywhere else on the mountain that year. Numbers like that don't come without risk, and everyone in camp understood that clearly. Running the operation around the clock meant daily costs that swung between $40,000 and $60,000 once you accounted for fuel, maintenance, payroll, and transport. A single unexpected breakdown could wipe out days of profit in repair costs alone, not counting the lost production, while machinery sat idle. Jake's team knew this going in, which is part of why the sensor network mattered so much. Catching small mechanical issues early, before they became expensive ones, was the difference between a profitable season and a financial disaster. As the weeks went on, the totals kept building toward numbers that seemed almost unreal for a claim most people had written off at the start of the season. By the midpoint, cumulative recovery had crossed into the tens of thousands of ounces, a figure that translated into tens of millions of dollars at current market pricing. That milestone changed the mood in camp almost overnight. The doubters who'd spent the early weeks predicting failure went quiet. The believers who'd backed Jake from day one finally had the numbers to back up their confidence. And outside investors who'd been watching cautiously from a distance started reaching out directly, some describing the operation as one of the more remarkable turnarounds they'd seen on that mountain in years. Success on this scale doesn't come without scrutiny, though, and Jake's team knew that big numbers needed independent verification if anyone was going to take the season seriously. Outside auditors were brought in specifically to weigh and record every cleanup separately from the crew's own internal tracking. Each batch went through careful weighing, moisture calculations, and cross-checking before any figure was accepted as final. It was a slow, meticulous process, but it was necessary. In an industry where claims about big seasons circulate constantly, having numbers that could survive independent verification was what separated Jake's operation from just another exaggerated mining story. While verification was happening on one side, production never slowed down on the other. The plant kept running 24 hours a day, workers rotating through shifts to keep the machinery fed and the material flowing. Every hour mattered at this stage of the season, because the deeper the crew got into their reserves, the clearer the picture became of just how much gold might still be sitting untouched beneath the layers they'd already worked. That's when the second discovery happened, the one that turned an already remarkable season into something potentially historic. During a routine reanalysis of the winter drilling data, Jake's geologists noticed signals sitting even deeper than the layer they'd been actively mining. These weren't faint, inconclusive readings either. The signals were consistent enough across multiple sample points to suggest an entirely separate gold-bearing layer beneath the one already being worked, hinting that the deposit might not be a single pocket at all, but a multi-level formation stretching across different depths.
That discovery reignited the excitement in camp, but it also brought a new wave of caution. Reaching a deeper layer means more expensive drilling, longer timelines, and higher risk of complications like water intrusion or ground instability. Jake, ever the calculated risk-taker, made it clear he wasn't going to rush into deeper extraction without proper planning. His team began mapping out a careful approach for the following season, including additional core drilling and possibly a new access shaft designed specifically to reach the deeper zone safely. By the time the season wound down, the final verified total had climbed well into the hundreds of millions of dollars in estimated value, an outcome that few people beyond Jake's inner circle believed possible back when that old Washplant first came out from under its tarp. The machine that half the crew had dismissed as outdated ended up being the centerpiece of one of the most talked-about seasons on the mountain in years. But even with numbers like that on the board, Jake stayed cautious about celebrating too loudly. He knew the story wasn't finished. There was still more gold sitting deeper in the ground, still more risk to manage before anyone could call this operation a complete success. What makes this kind of story resonate isn't just the size of the numbers. It's the fact that an operation everyone had already counted out proved that data, planning, and a willingness to take a calculated risk can turn even a written-off claim into something extraordinary. The old Washplant was a magic. It was math, upgraded machinery, careful logistics, and a crew willing to work around the clock to see a plan through. And now, heading into the next season, the same question is on everyone's mind. If this much gold was sitting in the layer they already worked, just how much more might still be waiting underneath? That's the story of one claim, one old machine, and one gamble that paid off bigger than almost anyone expected. Whether next season proves there's an even deeper layer worth chasing remains to be seen, but for now, this fictional crew has already written one of the more compelling chapters in modern small-scale mining lore. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you'd like to see explored next, and don't forget to subscribe for more.